Olivia, it looks like you are on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, welcome again. Nice to see everyone. Hopefully you had a few minutes to be able to introduce yourself and touch base with colleagues or new people that you've never met. Again, my name is Olivia Perry. I might be solo today. My colleague Theo Carter from the Office of Equity and Inclusion is having a transportation meeting overlap. So I'm hoping that she's going to be able to join us, but I may just be flying solo. Um, so bear with me. There's a big presentation. We're going to divide it into two different sections, so you can kind of have some perspective on taking these next steps to making your community more welcoming to people of color. So I'm just going to jump right in and go through the overview. And then, as I said, about halfway through, or maybe I didn't mention this, but halfway through, we're going to be stopping and just talking about any reflections, thoughts, or comments or questions you have. And then we'll finish the second part of the presentation and talk about next steps. Okay, then. Hmm. Can everyone see this? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We
Okay.
also do see your notes, though, in the next slide screen.
Oh,
I
you
think it's a
do?
good presenter view.
Okay. Good for me, not good for you. Okay, how's that? Do you see my notes?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. All righty. So again, welcome. So today we're going to kind of look at how the series came about, the purpose of the series, a brief overview of racial discrimination in federal housing policy and some of the ongoing impacts. We're also going to talk about, have some time to do some reflection and comments after the first section, which is about 15 minutes, and any questions. Some people will be really new to this information. Some people are, old hats, and so there'll probably be a diversity of experiences and thoughts or comments. And then we're going to start to talk about steps to becoming a more welcoming community, from little baby steps to some of the bigger steps that some communities in Dane County currently are taking, and then benefits of a diverse community and some takeaways and some next steps. So, oh, not wanting, oh, there we go. Not wanting to advance. Hold on a second. So how did the series come about? So as part of the regional housing strategy, which probably most of you or many of you were participated in or know about, the consultants asked the Housing Advisory Committee what their top priority for their community, organization, or business was. And these are the four results: the increased number of affordable housing, overall number of housing units, increase housing near jobs and transit, and provide more pathways to home ownership. When the consultants asked what your top regional priority is, reducing racial disparities in housing and home ownership was the number one priority across the Housing Advisory Committee. Also to build capacity and access, address housing needs, relationships, to build relationships and enhance partnerships and collaboration, and learn about housing issues, tools, and strategies. I will say, in addition to this impetus, over the years, I've had multiple conversations with many of you about what you could actually do in your community and what other people were doing. So it's not only through the regional housing strategy, but it is through conversations over the last many years with a number of you. In addition, the regional housing strategy identified equity as one of its core values. Historically excluded populations and lower income households have access to quality housing. So overall, the purpose of this series is providing information to residents, housing partners, and local leaders about the history of racial discrimination in housing, its ongoing impacts, and what we can do to begin to address it. So there's a lot in the history of discrimination in federal housing policy. I'm really just going to touch on some of these issues and then really invite you to learn more. Self-education is a big part of participating and making this work go forward. So today we're going to talk about redlining, race-based mortgage lending, racial covenants, the GI Bill, and look at predatory lending and current appraisal practices, and then some current stats on housing in Dane County. This will probably take about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And we're going to start with policies in the early 1900s and beginning with redlining and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Yeah, so basically the 1930s federal government Homeowners Loan Corporation was established to help stabilize the housing market from the impacts of the Depression and buy back mortgages that were in foreclosure and issue new mortgages that were backed by the federal government. Hulk, as it's called, by the late 1930s, Hulk had designed different maps for communities and neighborhoods and cities across the U.S. And these maps were for banks assigned to risk to different areas of the community. Graded A to D quality was not defined just by housing characteristics, but by demographics. Communities with even one Black household could be given a D grade, the highest risk for lending. The red areas were the degraded areas and were the riskiest and considered hazardous, and this led to the term redlining. In those areas, it was difficult or impossible to get mortgages and were based on race and were adopted by the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and the Veteran Housing Administration also adopted these maps. People who lived in these areas could not get mortgages, and people who moved out, often white people, moved out to the newer suburbs where they could get mortgages. So folks who were left behind could, as I said, not get conventional mortgages and often resorted to predatory lending, like things called housing contracts that came with a great deal of restrictions and high penalties for infractions, making it very easy to lose your home. Hulk ceased in 1950, but these lending practices continued even after they stopped lending. And we continue to see impacts from redlining today in many of these communities in areas in terms of segregation, and households in these areas are continuing to have lower incomes and fewer opportunities. So the next thing we'll look at is race-based mortgage lending. Basically, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was originally created in the 1930s by Roosevelt's New Deal. And one of their responsibilities was to provide insurance to help stimulate housing market and housing sales and homeownership. FHA also used discriminatory practices in their guidance to appraisers, and their guidance to appraisers was not to lend in redlined areas. Ensuring that Black families could not get mortgages. This was the main driver of segregation, or a main driver of segregation. The FHA also subsidized housing construction and backed the developer who were building in the new suburbs, and stipulated that those buyers could only be white. And all this was very explicitly stated in the FHA's manuals and discussions with banks, who and where the risk was, and steered investment toward the suburbs. So existing communities would then become neglected, and you would see what is called white flight in not only Wisconsin, but across the US. White residents moved out of these areas to newer areas in the suburbs that were essentially being built for white residents. This migration, the Great Migration, led to overcrowding in predominantly Black neighborhoods and continued disinvestment and deterioration of those communities. The next topic, we will look at racially restrictive covenants. Many of you know of this, have heard of this, are familiar with this, but this is another feature of discrimination in which many people, millions of people, were affected. So racially restricted covenants were put in place in the 1950s, and they were legally binding and forcible up until the 1960s. In 1968, they were outlawed with the Fair Housing Act. But these legally binding deed restrictions and covenants restricted who could live in a specific home in Dane County and throughout the US. And here's an example using really strong and painful language. I'm just going to read this out loud. Only members of the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any dwelling or said on said plat, excepting that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or a tenant. So not only did this keep people from moving in, but it also kept people from moving out because of the widespread restrictions elsewhere in the housing markets in Dane County and across the US. Covenants have long-standing impacts and prevented Black households and other people of color in their ability to accrue wealth from home ownership. The next policy we'll look at is the GI Bill. Many of you are familiar with the GI Bill. It had many different features of it, education, lending, but particularly we're looking at the federal housing policy. So it still continues today, and there's a new version post 9/11 that service members can apply for. But basically, it approved in the 1940s following World War II. It was approved in the 1940s following World War II and expired in 1956. But one of the main intentions was to provide World War II veterans with low-cost mortgages with lower interest rates to help them with financial support to buy homes. And it really just wanted to promote and expand homeownership as a way to thank them for their service after the war. However, if you look at the statistics of who was eligible despite Black military personnel and veterans who were eligible, this is not what happened in practice. I don't have an example from Dane County, but thousands and thousands of mortgages were available and almost exclusively to white veterans. And these are two examples in New York and northern New Jersey suburbs. Fewer than 100 of 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-whites. In a survey of 13 Mississippi cities of 3,200 VA guaranteed home, business, and farm loans made, precisely 2 had gone to Blacks. And the last federal policy I'll talk about or reference before we move to the sort of current outcomes and impacts is urban renewal. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this urban renewal refers to a federally approved acquisition and clearing of what was called slum areas to be sold and redeveloped by private developers. In accordance with city plans, in practice, it uprooted entire communities and destroyed the social fabric and access to vital resources for its residents throughout the US and here in Dane County. This was not by accident. When governments were deciding where to put new highways, new developments, this was a way to clear the area for Black residents. And overall, it's estimated that 63% of residents were displaced nationally through urban renewal were Black. So I'm going to move on to some current data that came out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And when we look ahead, they published a report in 2022 on the long-term effect of 1930s redlining maps on children and found that there were real-world impacts with those residents having lower educational attainment and lower annual income. So there are still real-world impacts from these policies living on with these residents and in these communities today. So the next slide is really, the next few slides are really not discussing federal policy any longer, but we're going to talk about some of the issues that come out of the private market in today's current lending. So we know that housing is not only a way to provide stability for residents and their families and access to jobs, but also to build wealth. The primary way to build wealth in the United States is through home ownership. So these impacts have compounded over time. As we know, it was a lot easier to get a house in the 1900s. They're much more affordable than it was today, but preventing people of color from homeownership and not having access to capital really inhibited their ability to build wealth over time. So in the 1980s, the practice of looking at credit score systems was implemented, and these are used to provide, as we know, loans on everything from mortgages to car loans. And studies show that Black residents are more likely to have missed payments count against them in credit scoring, as well as other subjective ways that these scores are being calculated. So how do you get access to capital? If your credit scores is lower, then you have to pay higher interest rates and have a harder time getting loans overall. When we look at credit scores in the lending markets, subprime lending became predatory lending up to the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis and was targeted. Here you can see the average credit score by race, which again impacts and reinforces existing disparities and can be a barrier to accessing capital. Highest credit score is among the Asian population, the lowest being Black households. So the common risks of predatory lending is, as many of us know, are higher interest rates, larger down payments, higher payments, and longer terms or greater interest with greater interest payments. And this is a slide of the percent of homeowners in 2004, 4 years before the collapse of the financial system. 52.9% of Black mortgages were predatory compared to 40% of Latinos and 26% of white households. However, when the financial collapse did occur in 2008, Black households as well as Latino were disproportionately lost their homes, the equity they had, and were unable to refinance. Though there are many more discriminating factors, the last one we'll look at is within the appraisal practice, which continues to reinforce racial biases. There have been many studies over the past decade that show how discrimination is baked into the appraisal process and the way appraisers value homes. Racial composition is a factor used to determine comparable homes for the appraisal. Appraisers use homes in closest proximity to the house being appraised, and those values are systemically valued lower where Black and Latino residents are present than they are in all white neighborhoods. So this perpetuates lower valuation for communities of color and is what is referred to as the appraisal gap. I'm sure, as I said, many of you are familiar with the concept of whitewashing your home before you invite a realtor or appraiser in to value it. And studies across the country have shown that when you remove the photos of Black families and replace it with photos of white families, appraisals will come in higher. This is also true in Dane County. So again, communities of color are continually undervalued, which reduces access to mortgages and equity gained from the sale of your home, as well as building your wealth over time. The next few slides, we're just going to look at some current data that further illustrates this. And while there are a lot of different factors that contribute to income disparities by race, the history of discrimination in housing is a really important factor. So the median income, household income by race in Dane County, this is 2010 to 2020. As you can see, white households, $80,000 median income, and all the way down to Black African-American of 38,000. And you can see on the next slide that this makes a difference and is an important indicator when considering your housing option and your ability to buy a home. So overall, 59% of Dane County residents are homeowners, 64% of white households are homeowners, and about 2/3 of Asian American and Hispanic Latino, 2/3 homeowners in comparison to whites, and Black African American are about fifth, the rate of a fifth as likely to be homeowners as white households. The next slide shows the cost burden by race and ethnicity. Housing is considered affordable households when they are paying 30% of their income on housing, as many of us know. If you look at the black and yellow box with red squares, you can see that yellow indicates paying 30 to 49% of their income on housing. Red indicates paying 50% or more of their income on housing, where Hispanic and Blacks facing the highest proportion of cost burden, approximately double the rate of white households, which means less money to pay for necessities, leaving few basic dollars for basic necessities like food, clothing, and other expenses. And then this is just an example of current home ownership by race, 2016 to 2020. It shows the change in home ownership between 2010 and 2020 in Dane County, with Blacks being the only segment of the population whose home ownership rates went down. And then finally, the last data slide we'll look at before we take a little break is the change of race and ethnicity over time. Between 2010 and 2020, the county became more diverse by 5 percentage points. All of the diversity, all the segments of different diverse groups grew except for Blacks. They remained at 5% in 2010 up to 2020. So I'm just going to stop there for a second and allow, I have a bunch more slides just to allow for any thoughts or comments, or if people want to put something in the chat. This is probably not new information for folks. If there's no comments or questions, I'm happy to move on. but feel free to share any thoughts or comments you have. Um, this is not easy information to hear. Um, and so I just want to give some space before we move on to the next section. Are people generally familiar with this information? Is this new to information to folks, or is this sort of just reminding everybody what you already knew?
I didn't know that home ownership had decreased
Yeah,
for Black residents in Madison,
yeah, I thought that was
but
interesting.
increased for every other demographic. That's new information for me.
No. Any other thoughts, comments before I move on? Questions? And feel free to use the chat. But I do know that um, many of you are very familiar with this information, so just wondering why this information is not more widely shared, known for the general public. That's a really good question. I think in it's not part of our general education. At least it wasn't, in mine. Although I'm 60, maybe it's more prevalent now in education, but that's a really good question. And I think hopefully this series that we're starting can help address that information gap. So thanks for the question. Familiar info, but very well presented. Nice job connecting current inequities to past intentional policies. Sure. Okay. Well, I think I will just move on to the next section. So becoming more welcoming. I'm going to go through a series of steps, and some of them are baby steps. Everyone is sort of at a different place in their community, their organization, or their business with with addressing this issue. So we're going to go through a series of steps and then talk about some examples in current communities around Dane County. And then, yeah, talk about some next steps and some information you can use to, yeah, facilitate work in your own organization, business, or community. So self-education is really the most important place to start. If you're new to this work, having a basis of self-knowledge or knowledge of understanding why to pursue or take this action or pursue this work. It's helpful if it's grounded in personal understanding, and it really helps you to understand your own motivation. Better understanding, it's also allows for a better understanding connection with history and our history and the relevance for your community, organization, or business, and to better understand how other people experience their day-to-day reality. Um, and it's a point of dialogue. It's also a point of dialogue. So, and then it can also help you unlearn stereotypes and identify what is truthful and what is not. Local leadership is really essential when you're embarking on this work. If you want to pursue this work on behalf of an entity, a local government organization or business, it needs to be someone's responsibility. And so there's some guidance, support, and accountability. It also sends a message that it's a priority for your municipality, organization, or business. What or who is a local leader? That really depends. It's up to the individuals, the community, how you want to start or conduct this work, but it could be a business owner, an elected official, a church leader, a neighborhood association, a student group, K through 12, village board member, subcommittee of the municipality, city administrator, et cetera. It really can be, a number of different people. And eventually it is, though, it's important to establish a body or a group and partners that you're updating or reporting so that education goes beyond just yourself or your group and helps you track progress and activities. So what form will it take? I've gotten this question a lot. Like, I don't even know how to start the conversation. How should it be structured? And so if you're a resident or community group, again, self-education is a great place to start. You can come together for a book club discussion or to view relevant videos. A neighborhood association would be a great place as well. Learning together in an informal setting is a really, valuable tool. and being part of a cohort that learns together. And you can also establish regular meetings once a month or an interval that can accommodate meeting participants. And then below here is some videos and some books that are really great places to start if you're looking for some information. So with local governments, it's really helpful to and important to have a guiding document, a statement or a resolution with a purpose statement. There are some examples here from the county, from Sun Prairie, City of Madison, GARE, the Government Association for Racial Equity, Government Alliance for Racial Equity. They're a huge resource, and there are links in here. I'm going to share this PowerPoint when I'm done. Yeah, so it's really important to have a purpose statement. So the committee or the division of the local government or subcommittee of your village board has a framework, a guide for discussion, even potential funding or program development, and a reference to measure activities in progress. And it opens up a place for dialogue and provides an opportunity to building trust among stakeholders. This is where my colleague, Theola Carter was going to talk about, so I'll just kind of wing it here. But an equity lens is also a very important tool and is being used widely in local governments. And so just, in general, what does it mean to look at things with a DEI lens from a municipal perspective? The idea here is that you're utilizing a DE lens. It's a process and a formal undertaking, and it's a way to recognize the persons in your departments or community or business and their different abilities and identities, including within yourself. Checking one's assumptions and biases, checking if the department is being inclusive, taking action based on information learned, and being the catalyst for change, applying what you're learning on the job. And who benefits? Are those who may be affected, informed, and included in discussions and decisions? How do you reach out to them and where is a question? Who's providing input within the department on projects and policies? It helps you think about, are we making sure that we're being inclusive? Are the policies, procedures, and practices contributing to the exclusion of others? And what is being done to promote inclusion within the department? What is the accountability for making changes that ensure inclusion in the department, and who is overseeing the process? So I would encourage you, if you're interested in thinking more about an equity lens tool for your community or your business, your organization, to reach out to Theola Carter. She couldn't be with us today, but she has extensive knowledge and experience working with this tool with groups, municipalities, and I will defer to her to talk more in depth about how that process works. But here's an example of, this is Sun Prairie's example of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that they've been engaged in for quite a few years now. They have a statement of guiding principles. And as you can see here, I'll just read this. As the city of Sun Prairie experiences rapid population growth, it continues to evolve into a more diverse and dynamic organization and community. We not only acknowledge, but also wholeheartedly embrace this diversity, seeing it as a source of strength and vitality. And here you can see on the next page, it talks about our commitment to advancing equity, honoring our diversity and identity, and fostering an inclusive culture serves as the focus of our daily endeavors. We encourage you to review our steps we have taken to live out our values and cultivate a community where all are welcome. And then their next part is, kind of an introduction to the DEI journey they're on. They established in 2015 an ad hoc steering committee on diversity. And the committee consisted of 17 members, as well as the mayor, who's here today. And they were, the first thing they were tasked with was providing recommendations to enhance the city's capability to locate, recruit, and hire qualified candidates with diverse backgrounds. And the second thing they were tasked with was to identify and provide a better understanding of the unique needs of different individuals and communities within Sun Prairie regarding city services. We also at the county have a very robust website with just tremendous amount of information that you can look to. And there's some grant funding out there. The PI grant, as you can see, is accepting applications. Well, it's passed now, but that's to promote equitable health outcomes in your community. So if you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to check that out. But this is the OEI website is a really great resource. And so is the City of Madison, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative. They have a tremendous amount of information on their website that you can look to, as you search for expanding the way you're addressing this in your community. And in the Planning and Development Department, Racial and Gender Equity and Inclusion I was the coordinator for the Racial and Gender Equity Plan in the county, in the Department of Planning and Development for about 5 years. And we developed a fairly robust website with information, videos, books that I encourage you to look at and explore. So going back to policy approaches for local governments, as we talked about, examining existing policies and procedures with an equity lens, from purchasing to hiring and reporting. We did that in the county many years ago. I want to say 2015 or 2016. Which then one of the recommendations tasked each of the departments within the county to have their own racial equity and inclusion plan. And yeah, again, that's a very, kind of robust informal procedure that Viola is quite the expert on. And so I would encourage you to reach out to her. But for one small example of what the county does as a way to kind of keep things fresh, all the agendas for the Dane County Board of Supervisors has 4 questions on it: who benefits, who is burdened, does not have a voice at the table, and how can policy makers mitigate unintended consequences. Yeah, as I said, it's a little bit less formal, but it is a helpful reminder to be more inclusive. And literally on every agenda of all departments, of every committee, this is on the top of the agenda. So it really helps people, helps everyone stay focused on that desired outcome. So here's some other examples of policy approaches. Developing a rent retaliation ordinance, which support lower income households and protects them from landlord neglect and poor housing conditions. I believe the city of Madison, Sun Prairie, and Middleton have adopted these ordinances. These first 2 ordinances and the rent abatement ordinance provides financial remuneration for tenants living in substandard housing, forcing apartment managers to address housing issues. By establishing the first 2 ordinances, you're really sending a clear message to your local apartment managers and owners that you won't tolerate neglect and mismanagement. And these ordinances also help support your lower income residents regardless of their race, and really lets them know that you acknowledge them and they're being heard and seen. Housing counseling offers direct residents to residents for housing counseling services to help them with leases, eviction prevention, and understanding their tenant rights. So that's a resource that you could either provide directly in your community or information on a housing webpage. And I strongly encourage folks, municipalities in particular, to have a housing webpage with housing information and resources as part of your municipal website. It really helps, if you can't have housing counseling in your community, it really helps your residents locate services that you can't necessarily provide, but that are very, very much needed in your communities. So this is just another way that folks can become more welcoming from a visual perspective by hosting events in recognition of contributions of people of color. So you could host an event at your local chamber, library, Lions Club, city council, or village or town board. You don't wait for Black History Month. You can invite a person of color to give a lecture on the topic of their expertise. Could be business related, science related, arts and culture, poetry, writing. You could have a community-wide event celebrating Juneteenth. There's also, of course, Black History Month, Latino Heritage Month, Indigenous Peoples Month, Women's History Month, Hmong, etc. And you could also put up a banner in your village hall, or have a book or art exhibit at your business. And then, yeah, and storytellers I've heard is a really fun option that sometimes people use or, invite, or, yeah. And so what are some of the benefits of a more diverse community? Certainly there are a lot of economic benefits. There are more workers, more consumers, attraction for people of color and underrepresented business owners. Socially and culturally, you're learning about different cultures, you're meeting new people, expanding your awareness, and it's helping to dispel stereotypes, breaking down cultural barriers, creating more inclusivity leads to greater empathy and compassion. And then segregated communities lead to disinvestment in certain areas. So isolating populations and diminishing resources helps feed into a stereotype and fear about other cultures, and it also negatively impacts tax base. So working against that is a really positive thing to do. And then also by working on these issues, you help to reduce harmful stress, increasing feelings of acceptance, and leads to more trusting, stable communities overall. So takeaways, self-education, like I said, is really important to understand your interest and motivation. So it's grounded in kind of your personal understanding or the understanding of your group. It'll look different for each person or group or community. And it's good to have a partner or colleagues if you're just starting out in general. Leadership is really helpful to have a designated leader so responsibility is clear. A guidance document, especially for municipalities, lends clarity to your effort and could be a resolution or a statement of purpose. And then really just in general, just pick a place to start or pick a place to build on your current efforts. How can you expand the work that you're already doing? And reach out to get support and guidance. There are a lot of people on this meeting today that actually are working on this. And certainly you can reach out to myself or Theola and yeah, to get more support or engage in a conversation. Here's some general education opportunities, which I mentioned earlier. The Dane County Office for Equity and Inclusion and the Dane County Planning and Development Department both have very robust websites with a lot of information. And then here's some conferences. The YWCA Racial Justice Summit goes on every year. It's a fantastic opportunity to learn more and engage with people who really know a lot about this area. The UW Diversity Forum, it just passed, sadly. But they have it every year. And then here are some books and videos that you can use to share and yeah, learn for yourself. And there's some organizations listed at the bottom there. And that's all I have for you today. So let's see here. Happy to take any questions, comments, thoughts, feedback. And I know there's some, I know that Sun Prairie and Mayor Esser is on the call today, so would be welcome any thoughts that you want to share on your experience with this work so far, Mayor or Sun Prairie, or what you're doing, or anybody who's actually working on this, and maybe you have some things that you'd like to share or discuss or challenges that you faced in pursuing this work.
I can start the conversation off. I don't really know if I have any kind of advice or anything other than when we look at this data and we think about the housing crisis that we're having here in Madison, or in Dane County in general, we know it's with affordable homes to purchase, correct? But when I look at this data and we think about renters, the only thing that I think about is the largest group of renters in this city are Black people, and they also are the poorest in this city. And then when we think about all the additional complexities that go with housing insecurity, how how are we able to support in a way that doesn't hyper focus on the people that are most disenfranchised throughout this county? Um, these could be this could be attributed to multiple different things. It could be attributed to lending, it could be attributed to credit, it could be attributed to many different things. But I think as a collective, that number is only going to continue to grow. And then that's going to create an additional 10 to 15 generations within this community itself that never knows what it feels like to own a home. So I just would encourage and empower everybody that when we continuously talk about, and I think it's very well known, but when we talk about people of color, we also have to understand that equity means understanding that everybody is at a different starting point. And based off these housing numbers, there are some people in this community that are at a starting point where they don't even know how to get to the race in general. So those are just my overarching feelings. And so I just wanted to express that at the moment. I don't really have a question or a comment.
No, Crystal, you're right on. You're absolutely so on. Thank you so much for sharing that observation. And I think the regional housing strategy really recognizes that and puts a whole list of action items in place to try and begin to address that. And one of the things we did, just one small thing we did in the last winter was expand homebuyer training, introduce first-time homebuyer training to the north side where I live. Because it's a much more diverse community. People don't necessarily have access to that information. And so, trying to expand homebuyer training was just one of the many action items from the regional housing strategy. So people who don't have history or knowledge about owning a home, especially people of color and more diverse populations could have access to begin to get that training, to begin to get to understand how you take the steps to becoming a home buyer. That's just one small example. Certainly, yeah, there are a lot more in the regional housing strategy, but it's really important to keep our eyes on the prize in terms of how to create opportunities for people of color, either to get information to, whether it's housing counseling, home buyer training. And then of course, I think we're all kind of familiar with this, the group called Building Black Wealth, Own It, and the work that they're doing and actually working expanding home ownership opportunities with down payment assistance, particularly in census tracts that are highly concentrated with Black residents and people of color. So those are just small examples, but you're dead on right. We have to be very specific and intentional about what actions we do and take to understand and meet Black residents and people of color where they're at.
So Olivia, this is Mayor Paul Esser from Sun Prairie, and I would like to make a few comments. Crystal, I know from Sun Prairie. I don't think she lives there now, but she has grown up in Sun Prairie. So, and what I'd like to do is acknowledge her comments right away because she really goes to the heart of the problem. She knows the people that are living the problem and the disadvantages that they have. Oh, you are still in Sun Prairie. Okay, well, that's great, Crystal. I'm glad to know that. So you've actually lived it, but I want to talk about the philosophy of what we started out to do in Sun Prairie in 2015. Sun Prairie in 2015 then and today is predominantly a white community. It's changing and changing quickly, but we are coming at it from the perspective of people that are concerned about the situation in Sun Prairie, but are not necessarily the people that are living the situation in Sun Prairie. And what we are trying to do is make diversity and inclusion an issue in the community so that people are more aware of it. And my goal is that the city government acts as a role model for the community as a whole, so that as we embrace diversity and inclusion, and we see that it is a good thing for the city government that gives us access to talent and acceptance within the community, that the rest of the community will endorse that and embrace it because it's good for the entire community. We have done a lot of things in terms of setting the stage, both in equity and inclusion and also in housing. They're so closely bound together. You can't talk about one without the other. And we have been working on both fronts. We've done a lot with equity in terms of community events. We did an equity audit of the organization. It's really an organizational study to make sure we're there. And we have on the same side done a lot with housing. We have a housing coordinator now, Becky Benz, who is on this meeting with us. We created a housing committee. We did a study of housing. None of those things in themselves are solving the housing problem, but it is setting the stage for gathering the data and understanding where we're at and where we're starting from. And it speaks to our commitment as a community and as a city government for that work. And we will continue on that work. I wish I could say to Crystal that we had the solutions to what she's talking about. She knows we don't have them, but we know we're caring about them. And we're hoping to gather in the people in the community like the Crystal that know about these issues and can be part of solving them in the future. So that's the work that we're doing. It in the end does not necessarily create more housing or housing that is accessible and affordable for people at lower incomes, nor does it necessarily add any diversity and inclusion into the community, inclusion of the diversity of the diverse community. But we are working towards it and we're committed. And I believe over the years, we are going to develop a community that is responsible to those issues, responsive, and will continue to do it over the years. So That's my comments from Sun Prairie.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for that. That's really helpful. Yeah, it's such a big nut to crack, but this conversation is making me think that maybe people, particularly maybe local governments that are, working to address this issue might meet on a more regular basis to talk about the work that they're doing, more specifically, the hands-on things and opportunities that they see that maybe we're not pursuing. But maybe having some sort of a group or at least a clearinghouse. We are going to launch a comprehensive housing resources website where we have a lot of information about addressing racial disparities in housing and home ownership, but it would maybe be helpful to have a more consistent ongoing conversation, a subgroup of folks, housing stakeholders to address this issue. Anybody else want to share thoughts or comments or frustrations? I did just see that Own It, Building Black Wealth, the organization I mentioned earlier, is having an event on December 5th. And I think we're all being invited to attend that, talking about the next generation of their organization. So please copy and paste that or yeah, get a link to that. And as I shared earlier in the beginning, this is right. I just, provided some initial steps that people are taking. I didn't really pull all the action items out from the regional housing strategy. But those will be included in our annual survey of what folks are working on and yeah, and the next steps they can take. Bridget, you have your hand up.
Yes, let's see. Okay. I just wanted to share briefly about a project that is moving forward slowly that is about housing, but it's more about the past. But hopefully we can use the past to prompt some action as we go forward. So it's called the Mapping Prejudice Project. It's based on projects done elsewhere, Minneapolis, Seattle, and other larger municipalities. And we've been going through our deeds at the county and obviously, Bridget, I work for the county. And so we're going through the deeds and trying to find covenants and trying to find all the racial covenants or covenant-like language on plats. And so far we have gone from maybe like 1920 to 1969. And all we have to go through about 350,000 records between 1900 and 1970. We have found many. We're figuring out how to best present that information and then what could we use that information for to mobilize action in other areas of housing in the way we live today and who we provide housing for and help assist housing and help assist get housing. There's a lot of actions that could be done that maybe don't have an impact, that are very much, I don't want to say don't have an impact, but don't have like a tangible outcome. And so how can we move the conversation forward and have some tangible outcomes where we can start shifting the needle a little bit? So it's still at the very beginning stages. We have some research funding hopefully coming to the UW to show how the racial covenants that restricted home ownership has led to the wealth disparities or correlated to wealth disparities and the wealth gap that we see today in the region. So hopefully we get funding to pursue that. And that would be really exciting. It's with planning and landscape architecture, ag and applied econ, and the business school, housing, and real estate department. So once we get all these pieces together, we can try to pull together some focus groups and figure out how to move forward and get some action done. And we really want to throw the net wide open and see what we can come up with. So stay tuned.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for that update. And would you also mind giving everybody the update on the library? No, the historical Dane
Yeah,
County?
totally. So the Dane County, a lot of this was initiated because of leadership in our department, interest in our department, and also interest from the Dane County Historic Society. They got funding to do it, to take the data that we're able to produce and turn that into displays that they're taking to all around to the libraries this winter. So I do have a schedule for that. I will be putting it in our Dane County Planning and Development newsletter. Olivia, if you want to forward that maybe to your group, that would be great. And they're going to be all over the county. And then, we're through a couple new locations at them. So if you guys have any ideas, they're already going to be in Sun Prairie Library for sure. Sun Prairie's actually been pretty involved in that project. So
Yeah, and
we'll send
if you want to learn more about the Dane County Historical Society effort to talk about racial discrimination specifically in Dane County's history, so there are lots of great examples. I've seen some really important information and statistics. Reach out to me or connect directly to the Dane County Historical Society and see if that you can get an exhibit to come to your business or local community. Matt, you have your hand up. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
I do, and I'll be quick here. First, thanks, Olivia, for holding space for this conversation. It is, I think, probably the most critical conversation that we need to have around housing, and just some of the things that were brought up. I just want to share some thoughts. So I work for the city of Madison, can't speak for the city of Madison. But I just want to say our equity division manager here says all of the time, we confuse this idea of equity with the idea of equality far too frequently, where we recognize that people have different starting places, but as long as they have access to the same resources, that's the goal. And it's not. I mean, equity means treating people differently because you sit and listen to them and get their different experiences and actually figure out their needs. And to me, with all of this, the big thing is we need to be hyper focused on folks that we have peripheralized and folks that have been marginalized in every single conversation that we're having, whether that's when you're making budgets for your department, for your agency, for your city, when you're figuring out what projects to take on, housing related or not, they all have impacts, like Crystal was saying. And so I just wanted to sort of call that out of like, if equity is not the heart of what we're doing as municipal governments, I think we're missing the mark. That needs to be the first question in every single conversation that we have. And it's spaces like this that make that possible. So really, really thankful for that. The one thing that I would just share that I just wanted to jump in on is on the racial equity and social justice initiative that we have here at the City of Madison. On that page, we have equity analysis tools. And those tools are designed to take a step back, pause a process, and say, how does this have equity implications before we start it? How can we change policies in this program we're doing, in this plan we're doing, in this budget we're doing to make it a more equitable outcome, specifically hyper-focused on the folks who have been peripheralized, marginalized, and especially folks of color in our community. So that tool is up and available for everyone on our website. Would love for folks to just take a look at it. And if you want to integrate that into your own municipal processes, that would be wonderful. And if it doesn't work for you, send us feedback. We'd love to hear that too.
That's excellent. Thank you, Matt. Someone asked if you could send a link to the tool that you're talking about. If you could pop that into the chat, that would be
I
awesome.
will. Thanks.
Sure. It is after 4. I'm so glad that everyone came to have this discussion with us, and this is really just proof that we really need to, continue these conversations in a robust way and potentially maybe gather on a regular basis to have these discussions in more detail and figure out some other action items or just be a community of support, if nothing else. But I will do my best to maybe call a meeting in the next quarter to see if we can come together and have a discussion. Yep. Yeah. So I will share that we got a new regional housing strategy housing planner, another one in the budget for 2025, and this is one of the areas I'm going to be tasking them with. Regional housing strategy is a huge document, and the strategic plan has many different parts. So I'm looking to help to get some support with this effort. But I feel, on behalf of the Housing Advisory Committee, who've made this a priority, I feel committed to moving forward and continuing this dialogue with you. So thank you so much for your input and for being here. And I will put this recording as well as the presentation out on the website, the regional housing website, rhs.danecounty.gov. And then, yeah, let's just consider this a good first step. And thank you so much for being here and sharing your observations and all the work that you do.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you. Good to see you. Nice to meet all of you. Thank you, Mayor. Good to see you. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Mayor.